Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to another episode of Manifesting Muslimah. I'm your host, Zara Pedersen, and today we're going to talk about law of assumption versus law of attraction. What is it? What are the differences? Which one should you be practicing? So on and so forth. So this was actually a suggestion from one of you listeners out there, so thank you so much. You know who you are. You slid into my DMs, and honestly, you guys, you need to do more of that. Because I love hearing from you, and that's the most important thing. Like, I want to hear what you guys like to listen to, what you want to know, the questions that you have, what you're thinking, all of that stuff. But also because I'm constantly looking for topics to talk about on this podcast. I'm constantly looking for things that are interesting enough for you to want to listen to it as well and keep you guys engaged and interested. But also just because I get like content fatigue because I'm constantly creating either for here, podcasts, TikTok, Instagram, and currently also newsletters. I'm trying to get back onto back on as if I ever really was on it. But trying to get into a regular posting routine with newsletters to all of you. So I'm constantly looking for content. So even if it doesn't get like a full episode necessarily on the podcast, it may be featured in a newsletter, a blog post over on Instagram, whatever. So, take a page out of this girl's book and send me a DM with your suggestions. If there's something that you're like, Zara, you are talking about these things on the podcast and I love it, but I'd really like it if you could talk more about this and that and the other, I would be so happy to hear from you. Anyway, coming back to law of assumption versus law of attraction. So law of we know law of attraction, right? That's what we've been talking about all this time. The law of assumption is that you, by believing that you already have the thing that you want to manifest, it's going to be manifested into your existence. As in, you don't have to do anything other than believe fully that it is already yours. So there is no way for it not to come to you. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, okay? The law of attraction is like attracting like, so positive mindset, positive thinking, also believing what you want is going to come into your life. But there are a few more elements in the law of attraction. And I would actually say that the law of assumption kind of falls into the law of attraction, as in it is actually one of the main steps to the law of attraction. So the law of attraction actually cannot necessarily work without the law of assumption already being in place. So here's the thing about law of attraction versus law of assumption. Which one should you do? Which one should you focus on? Blah, blah, blah. It doesn't actually matter because they're all connected. And that's the beautiful thing about every universal law that exists, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created those laws, which means that they're already interconnected. Each one of them does not exist without the other, and one cannot function without the other. So law of assumption versus law of attraction, it's a question I've been getting since I started manifesting Muslimah from, back last year. And I understand the question because so many people say, don't use law of attraction, use law of assumption. No, you're wasting your time with this. You should do that. And honestly, don't get caught up in the fine details, the little writings and stuff like that, because those things don't necessarily matter. What does matter, however, is consistency from your end, tawakkul and patience and sabr with Allah, and then surrendering to His will and timeline and making those du'as and worshipping Allah. All right, that sounded like a lot of things, but ultimately it means keep your deen straight. Right? That's what it means. If you're on point with your deen, I just punched the microphone, I'm so sorry. If you're on point with your deen, manifesting becomes so much easier, okay? So as long as you're kind of on point with that, kind of getting into the rest of the universal laws is kind of a given. It just comes naturally because it's such an integral part of a healthy deen. So I want to just kind of go through, let me just get them up here because I want to share with you. Sorry, I've got my laptop in front of me. So I want to just share with you the 12 universal laws. So I know of a couple of them off the top of my head, but just to make sure I'm not repeating some and stuff like that, I just got it here in front of me right now so that we can kind of go through them together, just so you have an idea of what I mean when I'm talking about universal laws, because I don't talk about that a lot, because ultimately, all of the 12 universal laws, I believe, are already in the Quran, one way or another, right? So one of them is the law of divine oneness. And this says the first and most foundational law of the universe is the law of divine oneness, which highlights the interconnectedness of all things. It says that beyond our senses, every thought, action, and event is in some way connected to anything and everything else. So as you can hear, this is exactly what I said before, that, all of the laws are interconnected and everything that we do is connected to another thing. So you cannot have law of assumption without law of attraction. You cannot have law of attraction without law of assumption. And you can't have neither of the two without the law of oneness, okay? I don't really like that they say divine oneness, because astaghfirullah, there's only one divinity, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But so we'll say the law of oneness. Then we have the law of vibration. You'll hear me talk so much about vibrational frequencies and vibrating at the right level, things like that. And that is that everything is in motion, vibrating at a specific frequency. And it says this applies to matter, but also one's personal frequency as well. This is what I personally speak so much about, that our vibrations connect with each other and with things. And this is where we give energy to things that have otherwise no energy. A common example is money. We give money energy based off of the energy we receive it with, give it with, all of these things. Law of correspondence states that patterns repeat throughout the universe, and on a personal level, our reality is a mirror of what's happening inside of us at that moment. Think as above, as below, as within, so without. And that's, again, very much the thought of like law of attraction. What you think is what you're going to get. What you believe is what you're going to get. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran states, I am to my believer as he thinks of me. That would be law of correspondence, right? So this is what I'm saying. The 12 universal laws are basically somewhere and somehow within the Quran or in the hadiths. So this is why I don't necessarily constantly speak very much about the 12 universal laws, but I find it very interesting, because when we go back to it and look at it, then we can see how it is so connected with Islam, and how Islam really already knew all of these things before we even understood and could really get a grasp of what these things mean. Anyway, I'm just going to read the other ones out loud. If you'd like an episode on the 12 universal laws and for me to speak about it and break it down, let me know, and then I'll do that in another episode. Then we have law of attraction. We've got law of inspired action. You'll hear me talk a lot about inspired action. Law of perpetual transmutation of energy. That sounds much scarier than it is. Law of cause and effect, law of compensation, law of relativity, law of polarity, law of rhythm, and law of gender. Okay, so those are the 12 universal laws. And well, now that I'm looking at this one, it actually doesn't have law of assumption in here, but the law of assumption kind of goes in with law of attraction, okay? And that's the whole believing that it's there, and then it basically comes to you, right? So when we are looking at people who are teaching us law of attraction versus law of assumption, what I want you to understand is that neither one of them is necessarily better than the other. However, what I will say is that law of attraction encompasses law of assumption, whereas law of assumption doesn't necessarily encompass the other aspects of law of attraction. Does that make sense? So we can use the law of assumption on its own, but we will be missing some very integral parts of how to fully manifest and attract if we don't also look at the law of attraction. For instance, if you're looking at the 7-step framework that I teach in my book, Manifesting Muslimah, it's linked in whatever bio you're on, where you can check it, probably in the show notes as well. So if you haven't got your copy, definitely go and check that out. But in the 7-step framework, law of assumption, believing in it, is one step. It is just one step. There's also the dua. It's not enough just to believe that it's yours. You also have to ask Allah for it because you're not the creator of your own reality, right? So there has to be that bigger power. Well, if you're Muslim at least, there is that bigger power, and you have to believe that you're not the one who's creating it simply by believing and that is it. You have to be clear on what it is that you want. You have to be clear on yourself, who you are, on all those things. You have to clear your mindset, because belief, it's the law of assumption simplifies what is in fact a very complicated for a lot of people theory or practice, because belief is such a huge thing for many of us, and a lot of our beliefs come from childhood and from our environment, our parents, things like that. And ultimately, when we're saying, oh, just believe it's true and then it is, yeah, that sounds so easy. Yeah, I can definitely do that. But when it comes down to it, that also means that maybe you'd have to go in and dismantle some old beliefs to make way for the new ones. And the law of assumption does not tell you how to do that. Do you see what I mean? Like, there's nothing wrong with using the law of assumption, and for some people it's easier than for others. But if you want the whole package, so to speak, then I would definitely recommend to look more into law of attraction versus law of assumption, because the law of attraction really encompasses all the other aspects and really takes into consideration the role of the law of assumption within an Islamic framework, where Allah is the creator and not yourself, not your mindset, not your vibrations. Okay, so that's what I sort of like, that's my 2 cents on this specific topic, and that's really what I want people to focus on the most. But don't get too caught up in all the little nitty-gritty things too much when you're just starting out. Ultimately, if you're wondering, should I do one or the other, just do whichever one is compelling to you to begin with. Okay, just do whichever one is compelling for you to begin with, and after that you can start digging in further and getting more into those details and figuring out how it works. How can I broaden it, so on and so forth, just like we do with our religions. At first we just have this like, oh, I'm kind of curious about Allah and why the Muslims are such happy, blessed people. And so people start by reading the Quran. And they don't start off by praying and wearing the hijab and reading the Quran and fasting for Ramadan. And no. They start with one thing, and then they start broadening their horizon. And that's basically how I want everybody else to look at everything else in life. Start with the thing that pulled you in, and then you can always broaden your horizon. There's nothing wrong with looking at law of assumption first and on its own. It has a lot of benefits. It really is a good way to really challenge your belief system as well, like to try and see, like, why is it so difficult for me to believe in this, and figure out if what you're trying to attract and manifest into your life is on its way or not, because it really challenges you on that core level of belief. Do I truly believe that this is available to me? So it is such a brilliant tool for that in and of itself. But yeah, so those are my thoughts on law of attraction versus law of assumption. As I said, they do go hand in hand. Take from it what you want, use what you want. For every person out there who's listening, there'll be certain aspects that you're like, oh, that's not hard for me, that's easy. And certain things where you're like, I'm really struggling with this specific aspect. So, that's how we're so different, and that's how our brains operate so differently. So be kind to yourself. If law of assumption is already sort of like an easy thing for you, maybe you need to look at your surrendering. Maybe you need to look at your gratitude. Maybe you need to look at the dua. Do you come to Allah enough in that dua and ask Him? Do you believe you're worthy in front of Allah to ask Allah for things? So, take from it what you can, leave what you can't use, and that's it. It doesn't have to be all that serious or more serious than that. In fact, it usually isn't. The more fun you can have with it, the better and the easier it becomes, and the less of a chore it becomes, and the less of a mathematical equation almost it becomes for us to then use it, because we don't have to overthink it. We just go into it and we're like, this is fun. It brings my soul joy. It makes me happy. It makes me a better person to be around, and it makes me hopeful for the future. So, and ultimately, that is what you want from your Islam as well, you know? So everything that you're putting into your life after that should give you that same result, because it has to reflect basically that core belief, which is Islam, and that this dunya, while it's a test, can also be good because you have Allah to support you throughout this whole journey. Anyway, my darling, I hope that answered some questions for you. If you've got, as I said, any other suggestions or anything like that, slide into my DMs at Manifesting Muslimah. I'm on TikTok and on Instagram and on Threads. Sorry, my brain farted. And slide into my DMs in any of those 3 platforms. Let me know if there's anything else that you'd like me to discuss, and I will see you in the next episode, inshallah. But until then, my darling friend, please don't forget to live in love.